I mean, there isn't any society in history that had anything like same-sex marriage as we have today.
Same-sex unions were known in ancient Greece and Rome, ancient Mesopotamia, and some regions of China. There are lots of different societies throughout history that have recognized same-sex unions. This would be a culturally relative equivalent to marriage that included same-sex couples. You're just wrong, Matt. Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh declare via facts and logic that marriage is between a man and a woman. Part 1. Apparently this is a multi-part series that they're going to need to demonstrate with facts and logic that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. So let's get into it. I'm sure there's not going to be any emotional arguments or appeals to religion. It's just going to be factual, because we know that Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh, they only focus on facts and logic.
Joining us online is Matt Walsh, host of The Matt Walsh Show on Daily Wire Plus and star of the massive hit documentary, What is a Woman? Matt recently appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast where he defended traditional marriage in the face of Joe's cynicism on this particular issue.
Matt's pretty consistent that he is very much opposed to gay marriage. Wild to me. Wild that you would hate freedom like that you would be opposed to someone's freedom to get married.
So the Senate is supposed to bring up for a vote, I believe today, the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, which actually just is not respect for marriage, it's respect for same-sex marriage.
Yes, which is a type of marriage. Therefore, it is the Respect for Marriage. It also protects interracial marriage, which is another type of marriage that conservatives have had a history of not liking, although today they tend to be more so okay with it. But yeah, no, it's the Respect for Marriage because it's intended to respect all marriages, be they straight, gay, or interracial, or same race. All those marriages deserve respect, and that's why it's the Respect for Marriage Act.
The act itself supposedly carries provisions that would protect religious freedom. They don't go far enough in that direction, as Roger Severino has written. Also, the simple fact of the matter is that why would Congress even have to pass such a law, considering that the Supreme Court has already determined that same-sex marriage is the law of the land, other than to get Republicans on record supporting the non-true idea that marriage is not between a man and a woman?
Actually, the Supreme Court has made it abundantly clear that they planned to revisit Obergefell v. Hodge, which was the Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage. Just like how the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, it seems that based on the arguments they used there, they would be very likely to overturn the Supreme Court decision that made gay marriage legal. So that is a very good reason to codify it into law, because we don't want the Supreme Court overturning this court case and then deciding that gay marriage is illegal. Just like how there is a Democratic push to codify Roe v. Wade into federal law, there is also this legal push to codify the freedom to marry whoever you want into law. And I think that's a good thing, because I think that, having consistent laws is better than relying on just a court case that can potentially be overturned if the Supreme Court gets stacked with the wrong judges, with a politically biased Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is heavily conservative leaning, yet most people in America do not share those beliefs. And so, yeah, we should codify this into law such that we aren't ruled over by this small set of judges that have a very unrepresentative set of beliefs compared to the American public.
Right. It doesn't make any sense. And also, I mean, if you can read the language in that bill and believe that this is actually going to protect religious liberty, then there's not much we can say to you. That's just that's naivete to the extreme.
The wording of the bill specifically won't do anything to affect religious institutions. We can literally prove it by pulling up the bill. In general, no person acting under color of any state law may deny. So this is specifically just talking about states, just talking about people acting under legal institutions. This is not acting about religious institutions in any way. For the purposes of any federal law rule, this does not do anything to affect religious institutions. This only affects governmental institutions. Look at that. The word religious doesn't come up in the bill at all, because it doesn't affect religious institutions. It only affects legal ones. They are just lying to you right now.
Obviously, this sets up, among other things, an assault on religious liberty, because if
How?
The federal government is declaring from on high that marriage now includes same-sex couples, and they're codifying that definition into law, and it's a violation of someone's human rights. If someone has a human right to be involved in a same-sex marriage, then it's not hard to see how eventually this comes down to the churches, and they say to the churches, well, you don't have the right to deprive people of their human rights.
This is actually not true, simply because churches are not acting under the color of state. So religious marriage versus legal marriage is a distinction. For like a legal marriage, you would go down to like the courthouse, sign papers and whatnot, and that should be available to everyone. A religious marriage is a type of religious ritual, and individual churches, individual religious organizations can have their own rules surrounding religious rituals, which does include denying certain people access to certain rituals. So essentially, this bill doesn't affect religious marriage at all. If a homophobic church doesn't want to marry a gay couple, this bill is not going to force them to do that. What this bill does is it allows that gay couple to go to the courthouse and obtain a legal marriage. This bill says nothing about religious marriages as a ceremony, as a ritual. It simply affects legal marriages. Matt is lying to you.
Signing on to this, it just shows you again the state of the Republican Party. I mean, 10 years ago, certainly 15 years ago, but probably 10 years ago, this would have been considered extreme even on the left. The idea that the federal government is going to decide and codify this issue.
Yeah, and if we were to go back 60 years ago, the idea that black people should be treated equally as white people would be a pretty radical idea too. Just because something was historically radical is a very bad argument against it. I mean, slavery abolition was historically incredibly radical.
But as we so often see, you know, what was extreme far left a decade or decade and a half ago is now something that even conservatives will take part in.
Yes, because that's how progress works. That's what happens as the Overton window shifts to the left, as social progress improves, as more human rights are codified into law, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that black people being treated as human is no longer radical. It's a good thing that women being allowed to vote is no longer seen as radical. It's a good thing that the abolition of slavery is not a radical idea. That's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that they're pretending this bill does is, quote unquote, protect religious institutions from having to celebrate or solemnize a same-sex marriage. Religious liberty already protects that under the Constitution.
Yes, exactly. The bill doesn't touch religious institutions at all. Therefore, because religious institutions are already protected under the Constitution, religious institutions won't be affected by this bill at all.
It is now apparently the law of the land and societal rule that the only rationale that you would possibly have for saying that a marriage is between a man and a woman is because you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. That's really the only reason at all. That the only reason will allow you to have these crazy beliefs so long as you can show that they're crazy beliefs.
Do you have a non-religious argument that being gay or allowing gay marriage is a bad thing, that should be illegal? If you're trying to claim that, you know, it's crazy that people only think that there's a religious reason as to why gay marriage is bad, you need to present a non-religious argument as to why gay marriage is bad. I would love to see him try, because there is not a valid argument like that out there.
You can show that the reason that you believe that marriage is between a man and a woman is because you read it in a book and because you really believe the book. They keep saying sincere religious belief. I don't even know how you measure sincere religious belief. Are we going to like now monitor how often you go to church or to synagogue, whether you keep kosher or whether you take communion in order to determine your sincere? I mean, the same media that declares that Nancy Pelosi is a sincere religious believer who's just for the mass abortion of unborn children will declare that you, Matt Walsh, are not actively in favor of the things that you're in favor of. You're just a religious bigot. You're a bigot, right? And your religion is a cover for your bigotry.
Well, it's almost like religious belief is not a monolith of belief. There are so many different religious sects and belief systems within any given overarching religion. I mean, like, Christians have never been able to agree on what the Bible actually says and means. So just because their religious belief differs than yours doesn't mean that they're not religious, unless you're trying to gatekeep religion. But if we're doing that, then, well, at that point, we're just going based off of your feelings as to what God should be.
I'm highly annoyed by the constant derogation of non-religious arguments into religious arguments. And this is what the left loves to do. They like to say, you're pro-life. The reason you're pro-life is because of your crazy religion. And so maybe we can respect your crazy religion along those. That is not the argument for marriage. The argument for marriage has literally nothing to do with religion. You could be a visitor from Mars, and you could see that all of human procreation relies on man, woman, child. This is not particularly difficult stuff.
Is his argument that marriage is valid because of procreation? Because that argument is easy to destroy when we acknowledge that infertile people can get married. Infertile people can't procreate, yet they can still get married. If marriage is just for the purpose of procreation, then by that logic, infertile people would not be allowed to get married. This is exactly why I said earlier that any kind of non-religious argument for the exclusion of gay marriage is just going to fall flat.
If you're a cake baker, then we're not sure about that, right? I mean, like, we're not sure how far this religious liberty thing extends.
So religious liberty applies to religious institutions, not like public businesses. This is what we decided in the American Civil Rights Act. Actually, the distinction is very clear. If you are a public business, you're not allowed to discriminate against people along protected attributes. But religious institutions, they have laxer guidelines, especially when talking about religious rituals. And that's why, for example, businesses can't discriminate against people based off of their gender, based off their skin color. But religious institutions can have rules surrounding the religious rituals they perform along some of those attributes.
I'm always trying to get across to people is that you listen to these arguments, whether it's an argument about marriage, it's an argument about abortion when life begins, even arguments about the definition of man and woman. Listen to the argument between a conservative and a liberal. And what you're going to find is that religion almost always comes into play. Someone's going to mention the Bible, but almost always it's the person on the left who's bringing that into the conversation. Because as you point out, that's the framework they want us to adopt for the argument.
Why would people on the left be the ones bringing religion into the conversation? I don't think I see that. I typically see people on the left that want to discuss empirics because the empirical arguments are where we win, and it's people on the right that bring up religion. Whenever I go live on TikTok doing debates, like, it's always people bringing religion to me. I don't bring up religious arguments unless they do, because there are no, like, non-religious arguments that are valid against gay marriage, for example. So yeah, that would be antithetical to our goals.
That the only reason that we would believe the things that we believe and say what we're saying is because we've been told by our religion and we have no reasons outside of that. That, of course, that's totally illogical, doesn't make any sense.
So what is your reason outside of that? Is it because reproduction? We've already debunked that. I would love to see them actually make the non-religious argument that gay marriage is not marriage. But we'll see if they even try.
When it comes to marriage, I mean, there's a reason why it's not just Christian societies, it's not just Jewish people that have said that that marriage is a fundamentally procreative union between man and woman.
No, marriage is not a fundamentally procreative union. If that were the case, then infertile people would not be allowed to get married. But obviously, that's not true. It can't be fundamentally procreative if we allow infertile people to get married. That argument falls flat.
You look at every society in human history, and they have come down to that conclusion. I mean, there isn't any society in history that had anything like same-sex marriage as we have today.
My sussy detector is going off on that. Same-sex unions were known in ancient Greece and Rome, ancient Mesopotamia, and some regions of China. There are lots of different societies throughout history that have recognized same-sex unions. If Matt's trying to obfuscate by the lack of the etymological term marriage, then that's just a bad faith argument. The word marriage first appears about 1250 to 1300 Common Era. Ah, yes. So these ancient societies in Greece and Rome, Mesopotamia, and so on, these would be before the term marriage even came into the language. As such, this would be a culturally relative equivalent to marriage that included same-sex couples. You're just wrong, Matt.
This is a conclusion that all people through history have arrived at.
Except it's not. The ancient Greeks did not come to that conclusion. The ancient Mesopotamians did not come to that conclusion. You are lying about history, Matt.
This is what I was trying to explain on Joe Rogan. It's the relationship between a man and a woman. That kind of relationship, it's just different in kind from any other sort of relationship. It has a capacity that none of these other relationships have, and that capacity makes it definitionally different.
That would definitionally exclude infertile people from marriage, which I don't think Matt's going to do. He is contradicting himself, unless he wants to bite the bullet and say, yeah, I don't think that infertile people should get married, at which point, that's weird, right?
Because it has the capacity to create people, and so that means it has to be protected and actually respected in a way that no other relationship really has to be.
Unless they're infertile, at which point your argument completely falls apart. Just the idea of man and woman, that would include infertile men and women. However, they can't produce children, and they wouldn't meet your definition of marriage, which you claimed was a definitional criteria. That's a problem.
You know, Matt, a lot of the arguments against traditional marriage rely on sort of false construction. So what they will do is they'll say, well, you know, polygamy was legal in the vast majority of cultures for a very long time. Therefore, marriage is not between one man and one woman. If you're including multiple people and you're narrowing the definition, this, of course, ignores the fact that every individual dyad within that polygamous institution is a man with one woman, meaning that the whole basis of even polygamous societies, as opposed to, by the way, there is no society on record in which the opposite is true, in which a woman marries multiple men. These societies do not exist.
They're literally wrong on every claim they make about history. Look at this. Polyandry, as in a woman marrying multiple husbands. It's been practiced in several parts of India, historically. They're just wrong. Like, they just lie about everything.
The societies in which a man marries multiple women, we have decided over the course of time, are not the ideal.
Oh, so if we decide over time that a marriage as being exclusive to a man and a woman is not the ideal, then we can change the definition of marriage, like we're doing now in the Senate. Great point, Ben.
Are not the ideal, like right at the beginning. A man shall leave his father and mother, and he shall cleave to his wife, and they shall...
But I thought we weren't doing religious arguments, Ben. You said that you didn't want to do religious arguments because you don't want to reduce conservatives down to religious people. But, okay. I guess you're going back on your word on not wanting to do religious arguments.
become one flesh. I mean, that is a monogamous relationship at the very beginning of the Bible. I mean, that's the Bible, chapter 1 of Genesis. But even if you were to argue in favor of cultures that allowed polygamy, the idea there was that it was always a man-woman child. It's just the man was pairing off with other women. It wasn't a polycule in FTX style here.
Like, bisexual polyamory was kind of the standard in a lot of, especially very early human cultures. Early human society cave paintings that we've seen. It seems to be that people were bisexual quite often, or in the default even.
Yeah, and the polygamous unions, if anything, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule, because, I mean, as you point out, there was never, as far as I know, there was never the reverse of a bunch of men marrying one woman. And
Wrong. We just disproved that. We had the cultures in South India that literally disproved that. Yep, here they are. So we're just lying, I guess.
You know, maybe societies in the past that had polygamy, you have even more procreation if it's a man with multiple women. Now, if it was a woman with multiple men, then that's not going to result in more and more babies being born, but the other way it does.
Well, then that completely disproves your argument, because societies like that have existed. He's literally disproving his own argument. Great job.
And so these were societies, especially in more primitive times, who, they also recognized that the purpose of marriage, one of the fundamental definitional purposes, is procreation, and that's where polygamy comes from. Now, we don't have that in our society for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that we recognize that a child needs a mom and a dad.
I would certainly agree that a child needs at least two parents. There are lots of studies which show that when a child is raised by a single parent, there tends to be negative outcomes due to that. But we also have studies which show that children raised in polyamorous situations, like, 3 or more parents, communal living, actually turn out just as fine, if not better. I think the more the merrier when it comes to parenting, but yeah, at least 2 seems to be a pretty good start, given that, you want to have multiple people who can share time and provide for the family in that way.
Not a dad and multiple moms, but a mom and a dad, and that's going to be the best thing for the child.
You would have to prove that in the studies, because we have studies on polyamory that show that kids turn out just fine, if not better, when raised in polyamorous situations. So you're actually wrong that that's what's best for children. That's just not what the empirical studies show. It takes a village to raise a kid? Absolutely.
And that's really that's what this conversation should revolve around.
If that's what it should revolve around, then you've already disproved yourself. Great job.
Best for a child. Every child that is born has a mother and a father. There's no other way to create a child.
There actually are other ways to create a child, with practices such as in vitro fertilization and even gametogenesis. We can actually produce gametes in a lab and then implant them into a womb. It's not the only way to produce a child. Science is cool, right?
Is it best for that child to be raised by those two people or not? I think obviously it is.
You feel that it is, but that's not what the studies show. The studies show that the more the merrier. It takes a village to raise a kid.
Yeah, Matt, this is the only reason that marriage is a social institution in the first place. Society has no interest in who you pair up with and have sex with. Society has an interest in how families are created because they are the units upon which society is built. Every historian, worth their salt, understands this. I mean, it's something Robert Nisbet wrote back in the 1950s, is the idea that societies are not built of individuals, they're actually built of family units, because you're born into a family unit, and then you form new family units, and these are actually the way that societies work.
It's actually a decent argument, but it doesn't prove that straight marriage is the only option. The argument they're making is that through government institutions, we should incentivize people to form social groups that are beneficial to society, beneficial to child rearing. And I think that that's actually a great thing to do, to incentivize people to form families such that we can raise kids in the happiest, healthiest environment we can. Now, if you're going to look at the actual empirical studies on this, you'll find that gay parents are just as good as straight parents at raising kids, that polyamorous parents are just as good, if not better, at raising kids than straight parents, that large communal families are better at raising kids than smaller nuclear families. So if we're trying to incentivize what is best for raising kids, you would actually want to incentivize larger structures than just straight marriage. So the argument's a valid one, but the conclusion would equally apply to gay marriage, it would equally apply to polycules and communal families as well. Actually, a good argument from Ben Shapiro here, but he's just not following through with his argument as he needs to be logically consistent.
The only reason that we even care about marriage is because of the production and rearing of children. Again, society has no interest whatsoever in you want to have sex with a person and you live in the same room as the person.
If you're going to use this argument against gay marriage, you would need to prove that gay marriage is harmful to the rearing of children, such as empirical studies which show that gay parents are not as good as straight parents at raising kids, but that's just not where the empirical data shows. The empirical data shows they are just as good at raising kids.
How does that help society in any way? The answer is it doesn't. Marriage is a social institution specifically because we have an interest in the bearing and rearing of children. And so essentially what has happened here is that we took a social institution and then in order to rewrite the social rules, we gutted the social institution in favor of a redefinition of marriage. I think this is a thing people don't understand when they argue about same-sex marriage. What they're really arguing about is the tip of the iceberg, meaning that the redefinition of marriage occurred back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s with no-fault divorce, with the idea of cohabitation. Same-sex marriage is just the final outcome, probably not the final outcome. It is one of the late-term outcomes of a complete redefinition of marriage away from family formation and family structure in favor of what marriage really is about is just sort of a voluntaristic association that you make with another human being for whatever purposes you serve.
For most people, marriage is about forming a social bond, one that is cohesive, one that is meant to last. That often includes family making, but even straight couples don't always have kids. So I think that there's other reasons why it still can be good to incentivize marriage other than just having kids. Studies do show that on average, people that are married are happier. It seems that people that, want to be in these long-term relationships are happier on average when they are. And so if somebody doesn't want to have kids, but still wants to form this social bond and it helps their mental health, it makes them happier, well, then that's a good thing. And I think it's still good that the government and society incentivizes that.
Yeah, I mean, marriage has, you might say 3 pillars, is that it's monogamous, permanent, and procreative.
So like if we don't fill all 3 of those pillars, we're not a marriage. Under that definition, people that divorce would not have ever been married, I guess, which is a bit interesting. But specifically the procreative part is the issue there, because that would exclude infertile couples, which I think their marriages are still real. It seems to functionally serve the same purpose of social cohesion amongst them, and they can adopt as well. But they're never going to bring up infertile people because they know it defeats their entire argument.
He gave up on the permanent and monogamous part back decades ago, and so it was only a matter of time before the final pillar falls. This is another thing that came up with Rogan. We were talking about he said, well, why don't people have the right to get together and love each other? And who am I to say? Who are we to say who anyone is allowed to love? Well, it's like, yeah, of course you can love whoever you want. There's no laws in place that can prevent you from loving someone.
There historically were. We do know that there are some conservatives that want to go back to those times where with like anti-sodomy laws and things like that. There are many states that actually still have anti-sodomy laws on the books. They just can't be enforced due to federal protections.
Why does that matter to society? What interest does society have in that? And why do you need your love for someone to be kind of made official and codified in this way?
Why do you? If you're asking like why do people need to have their love made official and codified, well, we had the social cohesion argument. We can talk about incentive structures, but I think incentive structures for social cohesion would equally apply to gay couples who adopt or couples who just want to get married and not necessarily have kids.
And I can't think of any reason why that would be needed unless the relationship is fundamentally procreative.
Why do you need a legal system for procreative marriages, but you don't need a legal system for non-procreative marriages? Why?
And the other side,
he's not justifying it. He can't justify it. He just likes procreative marriages, and so he's going to say we need a legal system for it. But he provided no justification, because you actually could do it without any legal system where people just have children with whoever they want to, and there's not like a legal system for it. I would agree that like marriage as a legal system is probably a good thing, considering that social cohesion tends to be a good thing, tends to make people happier, and we should incentivize that. Any argument you make as to why it's a good thing is going to apply equally to gay couples, especially if you consider adoptive gay couples.
they can never explain either why exactly it's needed. That's the thing.
But he can't either. That's the thing. He can't explain why procreative marriages need legal protections that non-procreative marriages don't.
Say that marriage has been redefined, but it's it actually hasn't been. It's the what we call the old definition, which is the only definition.
Weren't they just talking earlier about like the polygamous definition? And now Matt's saying like the monogamous definition is the only definition. That's literally contradicting themselves, because they literally acknowledge that there was an old polygamous definition of marriage that they reject today, that the definition changed. Contradicting themselves again.
Hasn't really been a new definition put in its place. It's the same thing they've done with everything else. Like they got rid of the definition of woman, but what's the new definition? Infamously, they have none. So what is marriage now?
Wait, does Matt not know what a marriage is? I think the definition provided by Google was actually pretty functional. The legally or formally recognized union of two people as partners in a personal relationship. Seems to be a perfectly functional definition of marriage that would include gay couples, that would include straight couples, that would include infertile couples. This seems to work for me, and I think it seems to work for the majority of Americans too, which is the institution it's supposed to serve. So yeah, it seems functional.
In principle, a procreative union and the foundation of the nuclear family, then what is it exactly? And I haven't gotten an answer to that. I don't think there's been an answer provided yet.
Is Matt going to do a new documentary? What is a marriage? This one's actually easy. This one's actually really easy. I think that this definition right here is perfectly functional. It seems to serve a social utility, and there's no reason why it has to be procreative, because infertile people can get married. All of those arguments just failed horrendously. I think it's crazy to see conservative rhetoric, going back to like homophobia, because it's such a losing argument on their side. I mean, the overwhelming majority of Americans are at least okay with gay marriage. I mean, if they're going to keep on pushing for homophobia, I think it's a very easy argument to win, because all of their arguments that we showed here were either invalid or horrible, or would equally apply to gay marriages. I've also seen both Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh recently having the take that if a conservative is like okay with gay marriage, that they need to be like ousted from the Republican Party. They have both made that claim recently, which, hey, if you're telling people if you're pro-gay, go to the left, then what is that, like 70-80% of people will be on the left? I'm all here for it. Please divide your voter base further. I will not stop you from doing so.